welcome, amigos and amigas, to today's Light and Darkness reading. Chapter 30, Tomorrow. When dawn came, the sky was covered with a cloudy haze, and the air was thick and humid. The clouds were a light gray. It did not look like rain, but the clouds did not seem to make the day any cooler. It was hot and stifling, and very soon the soldiers were sweating underneath their armor. Alva had expected an attack at dawn, and his formations were ready at first light, but no immediate attack came. Chinar's line just stood at the mouth of the ridge as though they were waiting for something. The Lassanian army stayed in formation, awaiting what would come as the sun climbed higher among the clouds and everyone became hotter and sweatier. When it got to be about noon, Alva saw the faint shadow of tall, dark shapes moving toward them in the mouth of the pass behind Chinar's army. As he strained his eyes to see what the shapes were, he heard a man near him say, "What are those? Bigger giants?" "No," another man said. "They don't move like they're walking. They are still except for the fact that they are moving toward us. And there are no heads. They look rectangular." Towers, Alva thought. Moving towers. Siege towers. Now, why would Chinar be bringing in siege towers? There's no wall. Alva was beginning to understand why Chinar had said Brock did not know how to use his best weapons. Brock would have never brought out siege towers at this stage in the war. What use could they be? It would be a simple thing for cavalry to bring them down. There had to be something he was missing. How are they moving? He thought again. Since they were coming downhill, there had to be a break to keep them from gaining speed and getting out of control. But how would they move on flat ground? There were no horses to pull them. The giants, he realized. The giants would push them from behind, a better use of one of Brock's best weapons. The giants proved too slow and clumsy to be of greatest use in combat, but for great feats of strength they were perfect. But what was he missing? As the towers came closer and closer, Alva could see just how big they were. They had multiple stories for entry onto walls of various heights. He doubted if any city in the world had a wall too high for them. 6 full stories, each as tall as 2 men. The towers looked like they could hold at least 200 men with all their stories combined. There were 5 towers altogether. They had been in rows of 2 when they were up in the narrower part of the pass, but as they came into the wider opening, they spread out so that all 5 were facing the Lassanian army. As the towers rolled down the hill, the men, who had been covered with sweat and sweltering, began to grow cold and then to shiver. Alva signaled for a cavalry charge, shouting, "Bonson, Diron, Kiel, stop those towers!" The cavalry rushed forward, intending to ride behind the towers and kill the giants, but as they came closer, the horses began to go wild. Many men were thrown from their horses, and others could not keep their horses from running away from the towers. The men themselves were stricken with terror, and they lost the will and ability to control their mounts. Diron, too, was thrown, though his horse had never disobeyed him since the day he had broken him in himself. Bonson alone kept his saddle and control of his horse, steeling himself against the terror that was beginning to make him shake and feel the same fears he had felt at the dry lake. He had been on Leishin, or had he been on Leishin, his usual unrivaled mount, the pride of the Twin Kingdoms might have fallen trying to single-handedly cut down the giants. As it was, Leishin was still in recovery. Though Bonson could keep his saddle on his replacement horse, he could not make the horse approach the towers, which continued to roll forward. The genius of Chinar's plan hit Alva immediately. The towers were filled with Dachmanim, protected from Lacinian arrows so they could spread their terror in force. Hope also understood this plan and began shining and singing loudly. This provided just enough counterbalance to make many of the soldiers hold their ground, though others began to tremble and collapse. The combined power of several hundred Dachmanim was too much for them. The hardiest men held until something unexpected happened. A large, round projectile of some sort flew from one of the towers. The tops of the towers were mounted with large catapults. The exterior of the projectile was black and shiny. It flew with such a force that it sailed over the head of the soldiers and landed behind them. Luckily, it landed in a spot where it did not hit anything, but when it hit the ground, it burst, and the ground ignited in flames. This sudden occurrence was so surprising it caused Hope to turn around and look at it. The moment her eyes were taken off the Dachmanim, those soldiers who were still standing turned and fled in terror. Bonson's horse began to gallop back toward the camp, and without Hope's support, he had no strength to hold it back. Soon he fell to the ground and lay there writhing in terror. Pincer and Prior were also overcome. They ran backward until their terror became too great, then fell to the ground screaming. The same images of terror they had seen at the dry lake once again flooded their minds. At that same moment, 4 more projectiles flew from the tops of the other 4 towers. The Dachmonian projectiles were cylinders of thick black glass, hollow in the middle, and filled with Dachmon's own version of burning oil. These next ones were more effective in their marks, landing in tents and setting them on fire. One of them reached a tent for the wounded at the back of the camp. It ripped through the roof and exploded with flames inside, setting the tent and many men on fire. Hendren, terror-stricken though he was, began to try frantically to help the terror-stricken men. Alva did not budge. As all the men around ran or collapsed in terror, the son of Alcala-Dene stood. Alone and proud, as though he himself could stop the towers. He had not yet even drawn his sword, though what a sword could have done against the towers none could guess. Besides Alva and Hendren, the only person on her feet in the camp was Hope. Nera had collapsed beside her. The fear of darkness did not affect Hope, but what could she do? She could not put out the fires which were being started by projectile after projectile. They were coming from towers as fast as the catapults could be loaded. She could not help all the wounded and burning men at once with her healing powers and simultaneously stop the towers that were moving toward the camp. "What do I do?" she screamed out loud. At that moment, as if in a vision, she remembered a conversation from another disaster many months before. She and her friends had been dying of thirst on the trail to the dry lake. Tombus had said, "Hope kept us warm through the rain on the plateau. Would it help if she sang a song about water?" Hellel had replied, "Whatever magic Hope may have, I don't think she could make water magically appear. The song would just make us madder with thirst than we already are." Hope looked up at the dull, rainless clouds over her head. The problem now is not thirst, she thought. What do I have to lose? Hope threw back her head, looked at the sky, and began to sing. At first her voice was soft, but as she continued, it began to ring out loud and clear. Though she sang in the High Lacinian, all who heard could understand the words, by sense if not by language. In translation in the common tongue, her song would sound something like this. The sun is nice on a sunny day, but the sun cannot wash the fire away. Rain is a friend when it's hot and dry, when the trees are starting to die. Come, my friend, we need you now, so the cattle can drink and the farmer can plow. Put out the fires, refresh the men, stop the darkness from closing in. All alone I can't stop this dark tide. My friend the rain must come alongside. As Hope sang, the gray clouds began to grow darker and swell. Lightning flashed and thunder clapped, shaking the ground. As she finished the last line, rain began to fall in a downpour. The drops were the size of walnuts. While they stung the skin on impact, they were cool and soothing and began to ease the men's fears ever so slightly. The rain put out all the fires very quickly and soaked into the dry, hard ground. It ran down the hill, quickly forming into small streams. Where the ground was flat, it began to loosen and grow soft. As the towers advanced on Alva, who was still facing them, the wheels began to turn with more difficulty. From behind, the giants continued to push with all their might, but their feet were slipping, while the towers, each weighing many tons, began to sink in the newly forming mud. When they were roughly 100 paces away from Alva, they came to a dead stop and could not be moved any further. Tons and tons of weight made them sink deep into the wet ground beneath. When the towers stopped, the Dachmanim began to exit them from the doors on the sides. They walked out in front and formed in 5 lines, facing Alva. They feared no arrows from the men writhing on the ground, and their eyes were filled with rage. Alva had defied them too many times. This time he would pay. Alva faced them without fear. He wore an expression of haughtiness and defiance. As they formed their line before him, Alva had several thoughts at once. He felt annoyed at Hellel for postponing he and Hope's marriage, which could clearly never occur now. On the other hand, perhaps it was better this way. Hope was young, and if she could survive, somehow, she could start fresh. For himself, what better way could there be for the son of Al-Saladineh to die than withstanding the Dachmanim and defending the people of Lassania? How many could he kill before they brought him down? 30? 40? There was only one way to find out. Whatever number of these black hearts he could stop would be a great help to his people. He looked at the massive Dachmanim and said, "What's taking you boys so long? I'm getting bored." The Dachmanim drew their swords and began to advance, 500 strong. 100 had been in each tower. At the same moment, Alva drew the sword that had belonged to his father and ran toward them. The Dachmanim could not run because they would lose their footing in the mud. Alva's father had taught him to run in mud. When Alva was within 10 paces of them, he stopped. He had loosened his shield on his left arm while running, and at the moment he stopped, he sent it flying into the face of the dark warrior in the front and center. The shield broke the upper plate of the warrior's teeth, and he fell to the ground unconscious. Alva drew his dagger with his left hand and began to walk backward while keeping his eyes on the enemy. Alva could move backward in the mud as fast as his enemies could move forward. Since they were in a row and he was moving backward quickly, they had to converge on him in a conical way. This meant that, initially, only 3 or 4 men could attack him at once. As Alva stepped backward, one dark warrior after another fell from the strokes of his sword and dagger. The fallen bodies gave further obstruction to the advancing warriors. When Bonson had fallen from his horse, he was within 100 pages of Pensor. The strongest warriors were all nearby, all having run until they had fallen. As the rain came down on them, some of the men regained enough strength and courage to lift their heads and look back. After seeing Alva's plight, Pensor and Bonson's eyes met. They simultaneously nodded. Pincer said, "We can't let him stand alone." "Come on," Bonson said to those around him. Sverrian was only a short distance from him. "What can we do to help him?" he asked. "We can't even walk." "Then we'll crawl," Bonson replied. "They'll slaughter us like rats," Sverrian said. "No one lives forever, Sverrian." "Fine, I'll crawl where you crawl." Not all the warriors that could move heard these words, but they got the idea very quickly. As Bonson and Pincer struggled to turn their heads toward the Dachmanim and crawled toward them, many others followed. These included all the companions from the Battle of the Dry Lake, as well as Deiron and Glandair. Seeing their master crawl forward, the strongest of Glandair's warriors followed him. The two sons of Hendren and Bali, Hendren II and Javin, joined them as well. Those who could got on their hands and knees. The rest wormed forward as best they could on their bellies. None of them knew what they might accomplish, but they were unwilling to let Alva die alone. Meanwhile, Alva continued to fight, constantly stepping backward and bringing down warrior after warrior as they came after him. He masterfully found the weak places in the armor while effectively deflecting their attacks. Arms were severed at the joints, knees were sliced, and many heads were taken off their bodies. Once the rain had started, Hope turned to look at Alva. Her heart was filled with anger at the dark warriors who were trying to kill the man she loved. Suddenly, fixing her eyes on him, she screamed out, "Hey!" All of the dark warriors stopped and looked at her. Those immediately engaged with Alva withdrew and took a step back. Alva also stepped back for a short breather. As the Dachmanim fixed their malicious eyes on Hope, she sang out at the top of her lungs. Her voice was clear, and there was a hard edge of anger and challenge rather than her usual sweetness. The words of her song were in the common tongue. "One small spark in a pitch-black cave shines like the dawn, shines like the dawn. All of you have nothing on me. Bring your best on, bring your best on." When she had finished singing, she drew her sword with lightning speed and began to walk rapidly toward the Dachmanim. Her song gave the crawling warriors new vigor, and they all leapt to their feet and began walking forward as well, forming a line in front of Hope as Alva stood waiting for them to file in beside him. For their part, the Dachmanim formed a line to meet this onslaught. They were not frightened. They still outnumbered the men approaching them by over 200, and they were mighty warriors. But had their numbers been fewer, they would have wanted to fight just the same. If they hated anyone more than Alva Dene, it was Hope. The Dachmanim thought as a unit, and cared little for their individual lives. If they could kill Alva Dene and extinguish Hope's light, they would gladly face their death. They knew that there were many more Dachmanim, and that Chinar had not sent in all the towers. Whatever the outcome, it looked like this encounter was to be the fiercest and greatest clash of warriors in the history of the world. But as the two groups neared one another, suddenly Chinar shouted, "Halt!" At his command, the line of Dachmanim stopped in their tracks. "Fall back," he cried again. The Dachmanim wanted nothing more than to meet their enemies in battle, and destroy both Alva Dene and Hope at any cost. But even they knew better than to disobey their master. Keeping in formation, they began to fall back. Not wanting to leave the camp with its thousands of cringing men unguarded, the Lacinian warriors did not pursue them. When the Dachmanim began to fall back, for the first time since he had first seen the towers, Alva took his eyes off of them and looked around. It was then that he understood. For months, the goal of the Lacinian army had been to keep the Dochmonians from breaching the exit of the Camden Pass. But when the army had fled before the Dochmonim, Dochmonian soldiers had crept in on the right and left side of the camp. They had killed the soldiers laying near the edges and had silently began to file past. The pass had been breached. While the Lacinian army lay dormant, the Dochmonians were pouring into the valley on either side of them. They were able to connect in a full circle on the opposite side of the camp. Soon the camp would be surrounded, and Cynnar would bring in as many soldiers as he chose before closing in and exterminating what was left of the army. At that moment, a trumpet was heard to the east. It was signaled by a group of men on horses, with about 15 wagons between them. There was a stark contrast between most of the riders and the horses and men manning the wagons. The wagons were driven by ordinary Lacinians. Balsasanar was seated on the one in the lead. They were Lacinian supply wagons. Their escort was composed of men on gigantic white horses. They were all tall with long blonde hair. They were warriors from Lassacrestin who had finally decided to come and join in the battle, apparently too late. It did not take long for the captain of these newcomers to divine what was happening. He was Caramenin, or Lavender Eyes. He was the one who had first escorted Hope and an unconscious Alva to Lassacrestin. He immediately gave the trumpet signal to charge. The white horses charged a line that was forming behind the Lacinian camp, holding their pace enough for the wagons to stay in their center as their drivers made the wagon horses gallop as fast as they could. The Dochmonians could see they did not yet have the numbers to stop this onslaught, so they moved aside and let them enter the camp, then closed the gap so that the newcomers were trapped with the others. As the Dochmonian forces continued to pour in, Cynnar rode within earshot of Alva and shouted, "It's over, Danae. The pass is breached. Surrender now, and you will be shown mercy." "Pull your men back, and you will be shown mercy," Alva replied. "Whatever you are, you're no fool," Cynnar continued. "Whatever you say, you know that you've lost. Let us not kid one another. Your army has been threatening to annihilate us for months, yet here we are. Yesterday you said that today was our last day, but as the sun gets closer to setting, my army remains." "There is no shame in your defeat, Danae. Perhaps it's time I introduce myself." "Oh, I know who you are." "Truly?" "Yeah. You're one more Dochmonian fool making meaningless threats." "Actually, I am Prince Matarin, son of the Dochmonon, and greater than all of the Dochmonim combined." "You must have me confused with someone who would be impressed by that. I'm the son of Al-Saladinay the 26th, the descendant of Al-Saladinay the 1st, before whom your ancestors fled this valley with their tails between their legs, and that's exactly what you are going to do if you don't want to die." Matarin laughed. At the moment he laughed, an arrow was shot from somewhere behind him. Alva saw it, but it was not meant for him. The arrow flew straight for Hope, who did not see it because her attentions were fixed on Alva and Matarin. It nearly pierced her heart, but at the last moment, Nira came running up from behind her and put her forearm in front of Hope's chest. Nira had collapsed next to Hope when she had been first distracted by the catapults. When Hope had begun to walk forward, she struggled to her feet to follow her. Luckily, her keen eye had seen the arrow. The arrow pierced Nira's arm through, and its ends were sticking out both sides. "Nira!" Hope exclaimed, and was about to express her thanks when Nira urgently cut her off by saying, "It's a poison arrow, Hope." Hope immediately understood. She grabbed Nira's arm above the elbow and concentrated. Nera's arm glowed so that the veins were visible, and a black liquid oozed out of the wounds. Then Hope skillfully broke the arrow, pushed it through, and rubbed the 2 piercings on Nera's forearm with her fingers until the wounds closed. Nera was safe and sound. "Oh well, it makes no real difference," Matarin said as he turned his horse to return to his base camp. By this time the Lacinian soldiers had sufficiently recovered to gain their feet, and their captains led them to form a guard of men around the perimeter of the Lacinian camp. Matarin would not attack immediately. He apparently wanted to bring many more men into the valley to crush the Lacinians in a vice. Alva thought about trying to stop the flow of men, but his men were in no condition for a charge. It seemed better to let things be for the moment while he and his generals decided what to do.